You know that specific, suffocating feeling when you've finally, after years of searching and striving, carved out your own little piece of peace in the world, only to have someone try to take it from you? Not with a weapon or a threat, but with something far more insidious. A rulebook and a condescending smile. My sanctuary was my grandfather's house, a place I'd fled to in order to escape a world of conflict and noise. But I was about to learn that tranquility is never a given. It's a territory that must be defended. The man who came to conquer my small patch of quiet was about to learn a much harder lesson, one buried in 60 years of ink and paper. Before you march your army onto a man's land, you had better be absolutely certain you know who owns the roads that got you there. The invasion began not with a bang, but with the metallic click of a tape measure. There he was, Mr. Gerald Harrington, the undisputed, self-crowned king of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, standing on my lawn as if he were Caesar surveying a newly conquered province. He was a man meticulously assembled from a catalogue of suburban aspiration. Crisp beige khakis, a navy polo shirt stretched taut over a slight paunch, and impossibly white sneakers that seemed to hover just above the grass, too pristine to be touching the actual earth. He held the yellow tape measure with a theatrical seriousness. Its metal tongue extended from the curb to a point just inches from the largest granite boulder in my new garden. 10 feet, he announced, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone designed to convey effortless authority. It cut through the Sunday morning quiet, a sound as unnatural in that space as a screech of tires. Precisely 10 feet. And according to Covenant 7B of the Oakwood Homeowners Association bylaws, a document to which you are legally bound by the purchase of your home, the first 10 feet of your property, measured from the mean curb line, are designated as a community visual easement. He paused, letting the jargon hang in the air like a puff of expensive cigar smoke. This assembly? He gestured vaguely at the rocks I had spent 40 hours and a significant sum of money to have delivered and placed. This unstructured and frankly chaotic eyesore is in direct violation of the Aesthetic Uniformity Clause, Section 12, Article 4. It will be removed by Friday. We have a preferred landscaping service for such rectifications, and you will, of course, be billed for the labor. He delivered this verdict with a serene, almost beatific smile. It was the smile of a man who had never lost an argument because he had never entered one he didn't already control. He was the living embodiment of petty tyranny, his power derived not from wealth or strength, but from a 3-ring binder and the quiet, simmering fear of his neighbors. I just stood there on my porch, my half-finished cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, and I watched his performance. I let him have his moment of absolute power. I let him feel the heft of his clipboard as if it were Excalibur, because in that quiet moment, as he basked in the glow of his own dominion, I knew a secret. I knew something he had forgotten, or perhaps had never bothered to learn in his quest for control. It was a secret buried in a stack of dusty, 60-year-old municipal documents, a secret sleeping in my attic that was about to wake up and devour his little kingdom of manicured lawns and beige mailboxes whole. He stood there, smugly claiming a 10-foot strip of my dream. He had absolutely no idea that I held the deed to the very street he was standing on, the pavement under his feet, and every inch of asphalt his neighbors used to flee their perfect, identical homes. His rules were a house of cards, and I was holding the one foundational fact that could bring it all crashing down with a single, quiet breath. He thought he knew the law. I was about to introduce him to history, and in Oakwood Estates, history was about to make a spectacular and long overdue comeback. The real story, the one that led me to that porch, doesn't begin with that tape measure. It begins with the distinct feeling of drowning in recycled air. For 15 long years, my world was the 32nd floor of a glass and steel tower in a city that never slept because it was too busy screaming. I was a senior urban planner, and on paper, it was a dream job. I designed public spaces, parks, plazas, waterfronts. I created logical, beautiful, functional spaces where people could gather, breathe, and feel like part of a community. In reality, I spent my days in sterile conference rooms, watching my dreams die a death by 1,000 cuts. I'd present a vision for a sprawling green space with native plants and winding footpaths, and I'd watch as it was whittled down by budget committees, value engineered by developers, and sabotaged by political appointees, until all that was left was a sad patch of sod and a couple of concrete benches. I remember one meeting with perfect, soul-crushing clarity. I had spent 6 months designing a small, intricate park for a low-income neighborhood, a pocket park that would have been their only green space for a dozen blocks. It had a community garden, a splash pad for kids, everything they had asked for. I presented it to the zoning commission. A man named Mr. Abernathy, a developer who owned half the city and had the personality of a foreclosure notice, didn't even look at my renderings. He just stared at his phone and said, "The yield on that parcel is more favorable for structured parking. We can add some planters on the first level for your green initiative." He didn't even look up. And the committee, beholden to his influence, nodded in unison. My park became a 3-story concrete box. I went back to my cubicle that day, looked out the window at the endless grid of gray, and realized I was suffocating. I wasn't creating communities. I was facilitating the construction of cages. My grandfather, Arthur, was the antithesis of that life. He was a builder, a man who believed the quality of a thing was measured by the integrity of its foundation. He smelled of fresh-cut pine and honest sweat. His hands were calloused maps of a life spent making things that lasted. He was one of the original builders of Oakwood Estates back in the early 60s, when it was all just rolling farmland and a dream. He didn't just build houses. He built a vision of what a neighborhood could be. A place where families could have privacy, where trees mattered more than traffic, and where the loudest sound on a Sunday morning was the birds. He was my hero. When he passed away, he left me his house, the flagship of the neighborhood, the one he built with his own hands for my grandmother. For the first year, it was just an address on a tax form, an asset to be managed from afar. But after that fateful meeting about the parking garage, I knew it was more than that. It was an escape pod. I drove out there the following weekend. I used the old, heavy brass key, and the moment I stepped inside, the silence was so profound it felt like a physical presence. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old paper. Dust motes danced in the golden bars of sunlight slanting through the big picture window in the living room. I ran my hand along the solid oak banister, worn smooth by the touch of my family for 50 years. In that profound quiet, I could almost hear his deep, rumbling laugh, and I knew I was home. The decision was instantaneous and absolute. I drove back to the city, drafted my resignation letter, and spent the next month extricating myself from the life I had built, a life that had become a prison. I sold my sterile, white-walled apartment and moved into my grandfather's legacy. It wasn't just a building, it was a promise of a different way to live. I spent the first 2 months just decompressing. I did nothing and everything. I read books on the sun-drenched back porch. I learned to identify the local birds. I walked every single street in the subdivision, marveling at the mature oak trees my grandfather had insisted on planting. I was healing, breath by breath. The house was my partner in this recovery. It was solid, dependable, and full of character. And the yard was a perfect emerald green, meticulously manicured rectangle. It was identical to every other lawn on the street. It was a testament to the suffocating conformity that had crept into my grandfather's dream over the years, like ivy choking a great tree. Arthur had loved the rugged, untamed beauty of nature. He would have hated this sea of sterile green. So I decided that my first act of truly inhabiting this new life would be to create an homage to him in the front yard. I envisioned a hoarevengestory, a dry landscape garden. Not a tacky suburban imitation, but a genuine tribute to the principles of Zen and nature. I would use massive, moss-covered granite boulders, sourced from a quarry upstate, to represent ancient mountains. I would have swaths of fine, gray gravel raked into patterns representing the sea. A few carefully chosen dwarf pines and Japanese maples would provide structure and color. It was to be my own personal patch of tranquility, a daily reminder to find beauty in imperfection and to follow a more natural, less rigid path. This wasn't a whim. As a planner, I approached it with professional diligence. I drew up the plans, I checked all the municipal codes for setbacks, drainage, and line-of-sight requirements. I was in full compliance with every actual law on the books. This was my land, my project, my tribute to my grandfather. It was a quiet, personal act of creation. I had absolutely no idea that in the tightly controlled world of Oakwood Estates, a personal act was seen as a political rebellion, and that my quiet little garden was about to become the central battlefield in a war for the very soul of the neighborhood. That is what brought Mr. Harrington, clipboard in hand, to my lawn that Sunday morning. He wasn't just a concerned neighbor. He was the president, founder, and supreme commander of the HOA. As I would soon learn from Carol, a kind, elderly widow from across the street who remembered my grandfather fondly, Harrington's obsession was personal. He was a retired developer who had built his career on cookie-cutter subdivisions, and he had once tried to buy out Oakwood Estates in the 90s to tear it down and build his own soulless tract homes. My grandfather had personally blocked the sale. Harrington, defeated, had then bought a house here out of sheer spite, and, upon discovering there was no HOA, had created one from scratch, slowly and methodically seizing control. My garden wasn't just an aesthetic violation to him, it was a ghost. It was the legacy of the one man who had ever beaten him, blooming defiantly on his doorstep. This wasn't about rocks. This was a vendetta, 60 years in the making. His first volley in this generational war wasn't the dramatic confrontation on the lawn, but a far more insidious attack delivered via a single piece of paper. 2 days after the first magnificent 2-ton boulder was carefully craned into place, I found it. It wasn't in my mailbox. That would have been too mundane. It was carefully tucked into the red flag of the mailbox, a deliberate gesture to signal its importance. The envelope was made of a thick, creamy cardstock, the kind of paper that feels self-important to the touch. In the top left corner, the HOA logo, a sterile, clipart-style oak tree imprisoned within a perfect circle, was embossed in gold foil. The letter itself was a carefully constructed piece of psychological warfare, cloaked in the language of bureaucratic authority. It cited, with pompous precision, Covenant 7b, the Community Visual Easement, and Section 12, Article 4, Aesthetic Uniformity of Landscaping Elements. It formally informed me that my unapproved and non-conforming hardscaping project, which it repeatedly referred to as an unstructured rock pile and a potential visual blight, was in direct violation of the bylaws I had implicitly agreed to upon purchasing the property. The language was deliberately demeaning, designed to frame my thoughtful tribute as a pile of garbage. The letter demanded a complete cessation of all work and instructed me to submit a formal landscaping proposal complete with material lists and architectural renderings, to the Architectural Review Committee for approval. A committee, it noted, which consisted of 3 members, all appointed by and chaired by Mr. Gerald Harrington. It concluded by giving me a 10-day compliance window, after which a daily fine of $50 would be levied against my property until the violation was rectified. It was a classic textbook example of authoritarian overreach. I had spent my entire career reading, interpreting, and even writing zoning codes. I knew with absolute certainty that the kind of possessory easement he was claiming, giving the HOA aesthetic control over a 10-foot wide swath of every homeowner's private land, was legally tenuous at best. It relied on a single, powerful weapon: intimidation. The assumption was that the average homeowner, faced with official-looking documents, legal jargon, and the threat of mounting fines, would simply capitulate. I, however, was not the average homeowner. I decided my first move would be to offer him an off-ramp, a chance to back down gracefully before this escalated. I composed a meticulously polite, professional email. I began by introducing myself as Arthur's grandson and the new owner of the property. I acknowledged receipt of his letter, and then, with surgical precision, I respectfully requested that he provide a copy of the specific, county-filed document, be it the subdivision's plat map, a supplemental declaration, or a deed reference, that legally defined and recorded this community visual easement. I explained, factually and without emotion, that my own title search and closing documents clearly indicated my property line extended to the curb, with only a standard 5-foot utility easement noted along the periphery for public works access. I was not challenging him. I was asking him to validate his claim with actual evidence. It was a checkmate move in a game of logic. His reply arrived in my inbox precisely 47 minutes later. It was a masterclass in dismissive condescension. "Mr. Stevens," it began, deliberately misspelling my name again. "Your lack of understanding is regrettable, but not uncommon for those new to a covenant-protected community. The bylaws are the law in Oakwood Estates. They supersede any generic documentation provided at closing. Your signature on the purchase agreement constitutes your unwavering acceptance of all community rules, as is. I have taken the liberty of reattaching the relevant section for your edification. The Architectural Review Committee meets on the first Tuesday of each month. I trust you will have a compliant proposal prepared. We do not, as a rule, grant exceptions, as that would undermine the very fabric of the community we have all worked so hard to maintain." He had attached the same crooked, poorly scanned image of the covenant page. He hadn't just ignored my request for proof. He had treated it as an impertinence. The message was clear. His authority was the only proof required. My attempt at a rational, evidence-based dialogue had been met with a brick wall of dogma. This wasn't about rules or property lines anymore. This was a battle of wills. The next day, the first official invoice arrived in my mailbox. A crisp, computer-printed bill for $50, with the subject line, "Fine for non-compliance, Day 1. Another one arrived the day after, and the day after that. It was a steady, relentless paper assault, a psychological tactic designed to create a constant sense of pressure and debt. It was around this time that the social climate on the street began to chill. My friendly waves to neighbors were met with hurried, nervous nods. Conversations would stop abruptly if I walked past. Harrington was clearly waging a propaganda campaign alongside his paper war, painting me as a hostile outsider, a dangerous nonconformist who was a threat to their financial well-being. My confirmation of this came one afternoon from Carol, the kind widow from across the street. She intercepted me on her way back from her garden, her hands covered in dirt. She kept glancing nervously towards Harrington's house, where he was, as if on cue, meticulously polishing his already gleaming brass mailbox. "Alex, dear," she whispered, her voice a conspiratorial breath. "I just wanted to say, what you're doing is so brave. My late husband, he would have loved it. He always said this neighborhood was starting to look like a hospital ward." She gave a sad little smile. "But please, be careful. Gerald can be vindictive. He got the Pearsons, lovely couple down on the corner, to repaint their brand-new front door 3 times last summer. He claimed their shade of colonial blue was historically dissonant. Can you imagine? They finally just gave up and painted it that awful beige color he recommends in the newsletter." Her eyes were filled with a mixture of sympathy and fear. "He's been telling people at the potlucks that you're a troublemaker from the city, that your rock pile will attract vermin and lower our property values by 10%. He just makes these things up. But people are so afraid of the fines, Alex. They're afraid of being his next target." She patted my arm and scurried back to the safety of her home, leaving me with the stark, cold clarity of my situation. I was utterly alone. This wasn't a disagreement with a man. It was a conflict with a system of control he had expertly crafted. That night, I abandoned any further work on the garden. The joy was gone, replaced by a grim sense of purpose. Instead, I climbed the pull-down stairs to the attic. The air was hot and still, thick with the smell of old cedar and forgotten time. In the far corner, tucked under a heavy canvas drop-cloth, was my grandfather's legacy of paper, a stack of heavy cardboard file boxes. Most were filled with personal effects, but one, a sturdy banker's box, was labeled in his familiar, strong handwriting, "Oakwood Originals." I dragged it into the dim light of the single bare bulb. My heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't know precisely what I was looking for, but I knew that Harrington's entire empire was built on a foundation of paper, his bylaws, his amendments, his fines. I was going to fight him on his own terms. I was going to go past his paper, to the primary sources. I was going to find the original truth of this place, a truth that predated his reign. I sliced open the old packing tape, and the smell of 60-year-old paper and drafting ink, a scent of creation, filled the hot attic air. Inside were scrolls of blueprints, surveyor's notes bound with twine, and thick manila folders bulging with legal documents. Somewhere in this box, I knew, was not just a defense, but a weapon. A map that would rewrite the boundaries of our conflict and prove, once and for all, whose kingdom was real and whose was a fantasy. The failure of his paper assault to break my spirit clearly infuriated Harrington. His next move was a brazen escalation from bureaucratic harassment to outright physical invasion. The definitive moment, the instant this conflict transformed from a frustrating dispute into a deeply personal war, occurred on a bright, sunny Tuesday afternoon. I had just returned from a productive consulting meeting in the city, one of the few things I still did to keep my hand in my old profession. I was feeling a rare sense of optimism as I turned onto Oakwood Lane. That feeling evaporated like a mirage. Parked directly in front of my house, its tires slightly on my lawn, was a large, garishly green landscaping truck. Emblazoned on its side in an aggressive military-style stencil font was the logo, Harrington's Lawn and Order, Enforcing Community Standards. It was so comically villainous I might have laughed if not for the scene unfolding behind it. 2 men, dressed in matching green polo shirts, were on my lawn, actively dismantling my garden. One was using a long steel crowbar to pry loose a 200-pound granite boulder, its beautiful mossy surface scraping against the grass. The other was tossing the smaller, carefully selected river stones into a rusty wheelbarrow with the careless disdain of a man clearing rubble. A hot, white flash of rage surged through me a feeling so intense it made my vision momentarily swim. This was not a notice in the mail. This was not a passive-aggressive email. This was a physical violation of my home. It was theft and vandalism, orchestrated by my neighbor and performed in broad daylight for the entire street to see. I didn't just park my car. I angled it sharply behind the truck, blocking it in. I got out, and I didn't run or shout. I recalled a lesson from years of dealing with enraged developers in contentious city council hearings. True power is never loud. I walked onto my lawn, my steps measured and deliberate, my voice dangerously calm. "Excuse me," I said, addressing the two workers directly. "This is private property. I need you to put down my stones, walk off my lawn, and leave immediately." The men paused, their expressions a mixture of confusion and belligerence. They exchanged a glance, then looked over towards the sidewalk. Of course, Harrington was there, observing the proceedings from a safe distance, his arms crossed in a posture of supreme command. "They are on community property, Mr. Stevens," Harrington projected, his voice booming with performative authority for the benefit of any peering neighbors. "The Homeowners Association, as per Covenant 14C, has exercised its right to rectify your ongoing violation. The crew has been contracted to restore the aesthetic uniformity of the easement. As per the bylaws, the cost for this service will be added to your outstanding account." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was breathtaking. He was having my property destroyed, intending to bill me for it, and justifying it all with his sacred binder of rules. "You are trespassing," I repeated, my gaze locked on the two workers, deliberately ignoring Harrington. "This man has no legal authority to order you onto my land. You are currently participating in the destruction of private property and theft. If you do not leave now, I will be filing a police report that will name your company and you personally." My tone, cold and precise, finally seemed to pierce their bubble of contractual obligation. They looked at Harrington, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. He just scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't listen to his empty threats. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I will assume all legal liability." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, never breaking eye contact. "I'd like to report a theft and vandalism in progress," I said into the phone. The word police had the immediate, desired effect. The workers dropped their tools as if they were hot. The foreman, a burly man with a sunburned neck, quickly walked over, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Hey, look, buddy, we don't want any trouble. We're just doing the job we were paid for. He showed us the paperwork." A patrol car ambled onto the scene 15 minutes later. The two officers who emerged looked profoundly bored, their expressions conveying a deep weariness for the petty squabbles of suburbia. I explained the situation calmly, factually, and presented my property survey from the closing, its lines clearly marking my ownership to the curb. Then, Harrington, ever prepared, strode forward with his binder. He opened it to the covenant page, his finger tracing the lines about the community easement and the HOA's right to maintain common areas at the owner's expense. The officers passed the documents back and forth, their faces impassive. Finally, the older of the two let out a long, slow sigh. "Sir," he said, looking at me with a hint of pity, "this is a civil matter. Based on these conflicting documents, it's a contract dispute. It's not a clear-cut criminal case of theft. You signed the HOA agreement when you bought the house. You'll have to take this to court to sort out who's right." The feeling of helplessness was a physical weight, cold and heavy in my chest. I had been invaded, my property damaged, and the very system designed to protect me was shrugging its shoulders. Harrington was glowing, his victory reflected in the officer's indifference. He nodded to the crew, a silent order to resume their work. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the air. I looked directly at the foreman. The officer said this is a civil matter to be decided in court. Until a judge, a real one, orders you to touch my property, you are still trespassing. If you move one more stone, I will file a civil suit against your company for damages that will cost you 10 times what he is paying you, and I will win. That, finally, was a language a businessman understood. Risk versus reward. He looked at Harrington's smug face, then at my cold, determined one, and made a financial decision. He ordered his men to pack up. They left, leaving a trail of scarred grass and displaced stones in their wake. But they left. That evening, my sanctuary felt tainted. The peace I had come here for had been shattered. With a grim resolve, I drove to an electronics store and bought a state-of-the-art security system with 4 high-definition cameras. It felt like a profound defeat, turning my peaceful home into a fortress. But I knew this was far from over. I had to be prepared. The next day, the cameras captured the proof of Harrington's pure malice. The footage, time-stamped at 2:15 p.m., was chillingly clear. Harrington, dressed in casual golf shorts, walked onto my lawn carrying a can of fluorescent orange spray paint. He wasn't just trespassing, he was there to desecrate. He meticulously measured 10 feet from the curb, and then, with the steady hand of a vandal, painted a long, hideous orange gash across my lawn, bisecting what was left of my ravaged garden. The hiss of the aerosol con was perfectly audible on the camera's sensitive microphone. He had physically branded my land as his territory. I watched the footage on my laptop, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This was no longer about rules. This was a personal, vindictive act of aggression. I saved the video file to a secure, encrypted hard drive. I didn't send it to him. I didn't call the police. I knew now that the official channels were a dead end. This was a different kind of war, and it would require a different kind of weapon. He thought he was drawing a battle line in my grass. He had no idea he was simply signing a confession I would save for the perfect moment, in the perfect venue, to ensure his absolute and public ruin. Harrington's brazen act of vandalism, a victory he thought was decisive, had only made him more reckless. He believed he was invincible, that his binder of bylaws was a sacred text that granted him divine right over the neighborhood. His next move was designed to be the final, crushing blow, a legal maneuver intended to bury me under the full weight of the system he controlled. Just over a week after he had scarred my lawn with his orange paint, a certified letter arrived. Inside was a formal notice. The Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association was filing a lawsuit against me in small claims court. The suit sought to place a lien on my property for an accumulated sum of over $2,000, a combination of the daily fines he had invented and the invoice from his lawn and order crew for their community cleanup services. It was a classic bully tactic, a war of attrition designed to bankrupt me or scare me into submission. But that wasn't all. Tucked behind the court summons was another, more insidious document. It was a notice for an emergency HOA meeting to be held at the local community center the following Tuesday. The stated agenda was a masterpiece of manipulative language, protecting our community assets and addressing ongoing non-compliant properties. With a theatrical flourish, the notice mentioned that members of the town council had been personally invited to attend and observe the community's unified stance. The strategy was as transparent as it was brilliant. He was orchestrating a public show trial. He would use the meeting as a stage to solidify his narrative, to rally the fearful residents against me, and to present a united front of outrage to the town officials. It was a preemptive strike, designed to politically poison the well and humiliate me into surrendering before our court date even arrived. He had set a date, a time, and a place for my public execution. He had created a ticking clock, and in his mind, it was counting down the final seconds of my rebellion. He couldn't have been more profoundly, catastrophically wrong. That notice, that summons to my own trial, was the single greatest gift he could have possibly given me. It wasn't a trap. It was a perfectly set stage. And after the discoveries I had been making in my attic, I knew exactly what role I was going to play. My evenings for the next week were not spent consulting with lawyers. They were spent in the dusty, quiet company of my grandfather's ghosts. I had a purpose now, a specific target. Each night, I'd retreat to the attic, immersing myself in the box of original plans. The smell of 60-year-old paper became my focus. I carefully unrolled brittle blueprints, their elegant lines a testament to a time when things were built with intention. I sifted through stacks of surveyors' reports, soil sample analyses, and thick folders of correspondence with the nascent county planning office from 1965. I was no longer just a resident. I was an archaeologist, excavating the legal bedrock of the entire neighborhood. My initial goal was simply to find definitive proof that the 10-foot aesthetic easement was a fabrication. I found it, and it was even better than I'd hoped. The original plot plans, stamped and approved by the county, showed clean, simple property lines. There was no mention of any such community easement. I then found the original HOA formation documents from 1985. The easement clause didn't exist. I kept digging through newer records I pulled from the HOA's own public website. The clause was added in a 2003 amendment. The president of the HOA board who proposed and passed that amendment was, of course, a one Mr. Gerald Harrington. He hadn't been enforcing a long-standing community rule. He had been enforcing his rule, a power he had granted himself. This was a silver bullet for the lawsuit. It was a strong, factual defense, but a defense wasn't enough. Winning in court would stop the bleeding, but it wouldn't cure the disease. It wouldn't stop Harrington from inventing new rules, from finding new ways to terrorize his neighbors. I needed to do more than win. I needed to end the war. I needed something that would not just invalidate his claim, but dismantle his entire platform of authority. The revelation, the true weapon, came to me late on a Thursday night. The attic was sweltering, and my eyes were burning from reading faded, typewritten legal descriptions for hours. I was about to give up when my fingers brushed against a thin, almost forgotten manila folder at the very bottom of the heavy box. It was labeled with a single cryptic word: access. Inside wasn't a map, but a collection of documents related to the subdivision's incorporation and the eventual handover of its infrastructure to the town of Oakwood. I began reading a document titled Deed of Dedication. This, I knew from my professional life, was the standard legal instrument a developer uses to turn over private roads, sewers, and common areas to a municipality for public ownership and maintenance. I scanned the list of dedicated properties: water lines, sewer mains, the small parcel of land at the entrance designated as a park. But something was glaringly, impossibly absent. The road itself, Oakwood Lane, was not on the list. My heart gave a sudden, hard thump against my ribs. That had to be a clerical error. A developer couldn't just keep the road. I frantically dug deeper into the folder. I found the original 1971 incorporation agreement between my grandfather's company, Arthur's Homes, Inc., and the newly formed town of Oakwood. And there it was, in crisp, unambiguous black and white. A clause that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It stated that the road system within the subdivision would remain a private access road, owned and maintained by the developer, until such a time as a formal homeowners association was established and could legally vote to accept the dedication and its associated maintenance responsibilities. But the HOA wasn't formed until 1985, 14 years later. I scrambled through the box again, my hands shaking with a mixture of disbelief and adrenaline. I found a file of old financial statements from my grandfather's dormant company. For decades, a small property tax bill had been paid every year to the county. The parcel was described only by its lot number. With trembling fingers, I typed the lot number into the county's online property information system. The map zoomed in, and a long, thin, serpentine rectangle was highlighted, snaking its way through the entire Oakwood Estates subdivision. It was the road. It was all of the roads. The HOA, formed in 1985 under a different president, had, through what I could only assume was staggering incompetence, simply started acting like they owned the road. They collected fees for its maintenance, they hired contractors to plow it, they wrote rules about parking on it. But they had never taken the final legal step to actually accept the deed from my grandfather's company. And my grandfather, a man who famously hated meetings and paperwork, had apparently just kept quietly paying the minuscule tax bill every year to avoid the hassle. When he passed away, his company and all its assets, including this forgotten strip of asphalt, had passed directly to me. I had been paying that same tax bill myself for the past year, assuming it was for some useless, forgotten sliver of land behind the house. I wasn't just a homeowner fighting an HOA. I was the legal owner of the very pavement that connected every single house in Harrington's precious kingdom. His entire authority, his entire platform for torment, was built on land that he didn't own. It was built on land that belonged to me. I leaned back against a dusty rafter in the hot, silent attic, the single bare bulb buzzing overhead, and I began to laugh. It was a low, quiet, and deeply satisfying laugh that seemed to come from the very soul of the old house itself. The public meeting was in 2 days. Harrington thought he was leading me into an ambush. In reality, he had just generously gathered every one of his subjects in a single room to witness firsthand the spectacular and public collapse of their king. I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't need to raise my voice. All I needed was one single yellowed piece of paper, and the entire game would be over. The Pine Valley Community Center, a drab, multi-purpose room that usually hosted bingo nights and scout meetings, was charged with a palpable, nervous energy. The air was a heavy mixture of stale coffee, cheap perfume, and the almost electric hum of impending conflict. The room was packed far beyond its official capacity. I saw the faces of my neighbors, a sea of expressions ranging from hostile glares, from Harrington's known sycophants, to the downcast, ashamed eyes of those who likely knew this was wrong, but were too intimidated to say so. Carol, my one quiet ally, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod from the back row, a tiny island of support in a hostile ocean. In the front row, seated like visiting dignitaries, were 2 members of the town council, looking somber and important. This was Harrington's carefully orchestrated arena, and I was the condemned gladiator being led to the center for the final spectacle. He stood at the podium, a position he occupied with the practiced ease of a televangelist. He was in his element, the master of ceremonies for my public humiliation. He had prepared a PowerPoint presentation. The first slide was an unflattering, zoomed-in photo of my unfinished rock garden, a red circle and slash superimposed over it like a warning sign. The title, in a bold, aggressive font, read, "Protecting Our Community, Preserving Our Values." He launched into a masterful performance of manipulative rhetoric. He spoke of shared sacrifice, of the sanctity of rules, of the silent, sacred contract they had all entered into to maintain a certain standard of living that protected their single greatest financial asset. He painted me not just as a violator, but as a hostile contagion from the city, an arrogant outsider who had come to mock their traditions and intentionally threaten their property values with my blight. He presented slick, misleading charts showing declining home values in other neighborhoods that had allowed unregulated landscaping. He read from what he claimed were anonymous, tearful testimonies from neighbors who felt unsafe, unsettled, and personally threatened by the aggressive nature of my garden. It was a symphony of fear-mongering and fabrication, and to my horror, it was working. I could feel the mood in the room solidifying against me. People were murmuring in agreement. The town council members were nodding gravely. Finally, he arrived at his grand finale, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "This individual," he declared, pointing a long, accusatory finger directly at me, "has not only refused to comply with the rules that bind us all, he has treated this community and its leadership with contempt. He has ignored official notices. He has refused to pay his fines. He has arrogantly defied the clearly expressed will of this neighborhood. That is why the board has been forced to take legal action. And that is why we have asked our esteemed town council members to be here tonight, to witness this clear and present danger to our way of life, and to lend their official support as we move to enforce the rules that protect every one of you." He opened the floor for community comments, a purely theatrical gesture. 3 of his known lieutenants stood up, one after another, to deliver rehearsed speeches about the importance of aesthetic harmony and the danger of letting one bad apple spoil the bunch. It was a well-oiled machine of public pressure. When they were finished, Harrington scanned the silent room, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "Does the homeowner in question," he said, dripping with condescension, "have anything to say in his defense before we conclude this meeting?" The entire room turned to face me. This was the moment. I stood up slowly, picking up a thin leather portfolio from my lap. The rustle of my jacket was the only sound in the suddenly silent room. I walked with deliberate, unhurried steps to the front. I didn't go to the guest microphone set up off to the side. I walked directly to the podium, standing so close to Harrington that he was forced to take a step back. I could smell his cloying, expensive cologne. "Mr. Harrington," I said, my voice quiet but carrying easily in the tense silence. "Thank you. Thank you for gathering everyone here tonight. You've saved me a considerable amount of time and postage." I turned from him to address the room, my new audience. "My name is Alex. As many of you know, my grandfather Arthur built a good number of your homes. He believed in this community. But I think, somewhere along the way, the vision of what this community is has become distorted. A community isn't about blind obedience to an ever-expanding list of arbitrary rules. It's about a mutual respect for each other's property and each other's fundamental rights." Harrington opened his mouth to interrupt, to shut me down, but I held up a single placating hand without looking at him. "You have spoken at length tonight about covenants, bylaws, and amendments, Mr. Harrington. You present yourself as an expert on these matters. So you must surely appreciate the importance of foundational legal documents. Documents that precede the bylaws. Documents like, for example, a subdivision's original county-filed plat map." I opened my portfolio and withdrew the large, rolled-up blueprint. With a flourish, I spread it across the podium, the old, brittle paper crackling loudly in the silence. This is the official map of the Oakwood Estates subdivision, as filed with and approved by the county in 1965. It shows every lot, every boundary line, every public dedication. As a professional city planner, I can assure you, it is a very clear and unambiguous document. I then reached back into the portfolio and pulled out a second document. It was a simple, one-page deed, its text faded from a manual typewriter. "And this," I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more deliberate, "is the official deed corresponding to Parcel 7C on that very map." a parcel described in the county records as a 1.2-mile stretch of land, 50 feet wide. A parcel that is more commonly known by its street name, Oakwood Lane. A confused ripple spread through the room. I could see people looking at each other, whispering. As you can see from the legal history of this document, I continued, tapping a specific line on the deed, this parcel was originally owned by my grandfather's development company, Arthur's Homes Incorporated. Due to a well-documented clerical error during the town's incorporation in 1971 and the subsequent and critical failure of the newly formed Homeowners Association in 1985 to formally vote to accept its dedication, the legal ownership of this parcel was never transferred. It remained, and still remains, private property, and since I am the sole heir to my grandfather's company and all its assets, it is now my private property. I paused, letting the colossal weight of that statement settle over the room. I looked directly at Harrington. His face, just moments before so smug and flushed with victory, had turned a pale, waxy, sickly white. So, to be perfectly and legally clear for everyone in this room, especially the members of the town council, I said, my voice now ringing with a quiet, unshakable authority that Harrington's had always lacked. The 10-foot visual easement you have been using to terrorize me, and likely many others, is legally null and void. An HOA cannot claim an easement on land that is adjacent to a road it does not own. In fact, every time any of you pull out of your driveways to go to work, every time you walk your dogs on the sidewalk, every time you park your car on the street, you are doing so on my private property. The silence that followed was not just an absence of noise. It was a physical vacuum. It was the sound of a 60-year-old reality collapsing in on itself. Then, the vacuum was filled with chaos. People were gasping, shouting, pulling out their phones to look up their own property records. Harrington stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently, his entire world crumbling around him. The town council members were staring at me, then at each other, their jaws hanging open. I wasn't finished. "Mr. Harrington," I said, turning to him one last time, "you trespassed on my property. You ordered your employees to destroy my garden. You personally vandalized my lawn with spray paint. Under the law, that makes you a trespasser, a vandal, and financially liable for all damages." I let him absorb that for a second before delivering the coup de grace. "But don't worry." I looked back out at my stunned, chaotic audience of neighbors. "I have no interest in being a tyrant. Unlike some people, I am, as of this moment, prepared to sign the deed of dedication and turn Oakwood Lane and all its connecting streets over to the town of Oakwood, free and clear, making them public roads forever." I held up a hand to quiet the sudden buzz of relief. "But I have one non-negotiable condition: the immediate and permanent dissolution of HOA Covenant 7B and all related aesthetic uniformity clauses that have allowed one man's narrow personal taste to become a weapon against his neighbors. We can be a community of individuals who respect each other, or we can continue to be a kingdom ruled by a committee of one. The choice," I said, looking around the room, "is yours." The spell was shattered. The fear that had held the neighborhood in its grip for years was gone, replaced by a tidal wave of angry, liberated energy. People were on their feet, not shouting at me, but at Harrington. They were demanding answers about the road, about the money they'd paid for its maintenance, about other rules, other fines. His power, which had seemed as solid and immovable as one of my granite boulders, had been revealed for what it was: an illusion. It was a story he had told them, over and over, until they believed it. I had simply shown up with a better, truer story. He was a king with no land, a landlord who had been a tenant all along. And his long beige reign was finally, spectacularly, over. The aftermath of that explosive meeting was far quieter than the climax, but its effects were infinitely more profound. Harrington's meticulously constructed world of control didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The lawsuit against me was withdrawn by a sheepish-looking HOA lawyer the very next morning. Within a week, a special petition circulated the neighborhood with unprecedented speed, and a vote of no confidence was called. Harrington was removed as HOA president in a landslide vote. His small, loyal cabal of board members, suddenly stripped of their leader and their authority, resigned in a flurry of indignant emails. The man who had built his entire post-retirement identity on being the arbiter of community standards could not bear to live in a community he no longer controlled. Less than a month later, a for sale sign was hammered into his own perfectly manicured community easement-free lawn. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he and his wife had moved to a massive, walled-off retirement community in Florida, a place with a rulebook so thick it required its own golf cart. A place where he could finally be a compliant, anonymous subject instead of a deposed, humiliated king. True to my word, I met with the town council and their attorneys. We drafted the dedication documents, and with a simple signature, I turned over ownership of the streets to the town. Oakwood Lane became a public road, and the town, both grateful for the gift and likely a little embarrassed by their own 60-year oversight, formally ratified the neighborhood's vote to strike the aesthetic covenants from the HOA's governing documents. The change in the neighborhood wasn't like flipping a switch. It was more like the slow, steady arrival of spring after a long, oppressive winter. The first sign of the thaw was Mrs. Pearson's front door. A week after the meeting, it was painted a brilliant, defiant, and utterly beautiful shade of sapphire blue. Then, other small acts of individuality began to bloom. The Millers planted a sprawling, chaotic vegetable garden in their front yard. The family down the street put up a basketball hoop over their garage, and the sound of kids laughing and a ball bouncing on asphalt, once a finable offense, became the new evening soundtrack. My own garden, the original battlefield, became something of a local landmark. People I'd only known as scared, averted eyes would stop by while I was working. They wouldn't just compliment the rocks, they'd ask about them. They'd ask about the different types of moss, about the principles of raking the gravel, about where I had found the courage to fight back. I finished the garden, and it became my sanctuary, just as I had always intended. But it was more than that now. It was a monument to a quiet victory, a reminder that the world doesn't have to be a uniform shade of beige unless you allow it to be. Through this whole ordeal, I learned something deeper than property law. My grandfather had left me more than just a house and a portfolio of forgotten legal entities. He had left me a powerful lesson about the true nature of power. Real power isn't found in a binder full of rules or in the ability to intimidate your neighbors into conformity. It's not loud, it's not arrogant, and it doesn't need a PowerPoint presentation. True, foundational power is quiet. It's structural. It's the simple, unshakable force of knowing the history, of understanding the framework upon which everything else is built. Harrington had spent years trying to control the surface, the color of doors, the height of grass, the placement of stones. He was obsessed with the aesthetics, the visible layer of the world. My grandfather, and by extension, me, had controlled the bedrock beneath it all. And when the fragile surface is in conflict with the solid foundation, the foundation wins, every single time. So now, when I sit on my front porch drinking my morning coffee, I look out at a community that is more vibrant, more interesting, and more genuinely connected than I ever thought possible. We are not perfect, but we are wonderfully, beautifully real. We are a collection of individuals learning to live together, not a platoon of identical soldiers marching in perfect formation. And it all happened because one man pushed too far, and another man, seeking only peace, was forced to look for answers in a dusty old box in his attic. It's a powerful reminder for anyone out there who feels trapped by a system, by a boss, by a set of rules that feels fundamentally wrong. Don't just fight the surface. Dig deeper. Look for the foundation. Question the assumptions. You might just discover that you have more power than you think. You might just discover that you own the whole street. What's the most ridiculous, absurd rule your own HOA or neighborhood has ever tried to enforce? I truly want to hear about it. Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might just be the spark of courage someone else needs to start digging into their own foundations. And if you enjoy these stories of petty tyrants getting their long overdue comeuppance and communities finding their voice, then please do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming up next. Next week, we're going to tell the incredible story of a corporate boss who tried to steal his most brilliant employee's new invention, presenting it to the board as his own. He had no idea that the final patent had been filed the day before, in the employee's wife's name, and she just happened to be the toughest patent lawyer in the state. It's a story of corporate greed and marital genius you won't want to miss.